Hello and welcome to the New Orchid Show. Earlier this year, I had the pleasure of attending an event in Melbourne organised by Classical Education Australia and the Australian Classical Education Society. This event was primarily fronted by Andrew Kern, who is the founder of Circe Institute in the US. Andrew delivered a very interesting keynote about his life journey, his institute, and the power as well as relevance of classical education in a modern world. At its foundation, his presentation, I would say, was focused on classical education movement in the US, how it's grown over the years, and what impact it had on positive outcomes. Andrew's inspirational words and stories, as well as the data he presented, has made me very curious and caused me to look a little bit deeper into classical education. I had a good look at what's going on in North America specifically, and found a market analysis by Arcadia Education. In a recently published study, this market analysis, classical school enrollment for the 2023-2024 school years is estimated at over 677,000 students. These students are spread among 1,551 schools. Nearly 39% of those students receive classical education by way of at-home learning, co-ops or microschools. Another 34% attend a Christian evangelical classical school, over 18% attend a classical public charter school, and almost 9% attend a Catholic classical school. The Arcadia Education Market Analysis claim that these estimates are conservative and do not include homeschooled students who use a variety of different programs, including classical, for a portion of their learning. Also worth mentioning here that in the US, there are upwards of 50 online education providers who also deliver holistic classical education to students. These are very impressive numbers for something that supposedly exists on the fringes of mainstream. It's no secret what's causing this trend. Simply put, the unnecessary politically driven prolonged school closures between 2020 and 2022 gave parents who chose to pay attention a front row seat in their children's schooling. It did not take long for parents to notice that the quality of education, as well as excessive non-academic related content that did not necessarily align with their values, is a problem that's going to lead to, suboptimal outcomes for their families. The writing was on the wall, and parents who chose to pay attention, started to react to it. They started talking about these issues at their local school board meetings, and total chaos ensued. I'm going to put some links in the show notes so you better understand what I'm talking about here. You'll be able to find hundreds of such clips on YouTube and Rumble where parents go to school board meetings, there's a lot of yelling between the board and the parents, nobody's listening, police come, and it's just total chaos. I would encourage you to have a look at some of those clips, as it will give you some foundational idea of what the problem is underpinned by in different states in America. This is obviously not unique to a single school. This was happening all over the US, and was one of the key reasons why a lot of mothers rallied behind Glenn Youngkin and got him elected, got him over the line to become the governor of Virginia in 2022. Once in the office, Glenn Youngkin signed his first executive order in line with his campaign promise, which was, and I quote, ending the use of inherently divisive concepts, including critical race theory, and restoring excellence in K-12 public education in the Commonwealth, end quote. This would not have happened had parents not witnessed what their kids were being exposed to online between 2020 and 2022. In some other instances, parents did not have a good politician wanting to represent them, or a school board open-minded enough to listen. Their voices ignored forced them to look for alternative solutions, options outside of the public mainstream. Between 2019 and 2023, 264 new classical schools were started in the US. This occurred with an average 4.8 growth rate of new schools per year. On top of these new schools, enrollment to already established classical education schools exploded. Again, Arcadia Education forecasts that by 2035, 1.4 million K-12 students will be enrolled in classical school. That roughly translates to 2.4% of all K-12 students in the US. Within that forecast, the largest subset would be over 522,000 students receiving classical education through a homeschool co-op, online school, or a microschool. What's the conclusion from all of this? Well, it would appear that parents want alternative school options beyond traditional district public schools for their children, and record numbers are opting for classical education. And this essentially brings me to my guest today, Jonathan Hili and Kon Bouzikos, who will introduce us to the fundamentals of classical education and tell us about their inspiring mission to both establish and promote classical education in Australia. Jonathan Hili has been teaching high school English, humanities and religious education in Australia for over 20 years. His educational background and interests are in history, sociology, philosophy and theology. Jonathan became involved in classical education movement because of his passion for the liberal arts, great ideas, and wanting to help his students think more precisely, cogently and critically. He is currently the secretary of the Australian Classical Education Society. The second guest is Kon Bouzikos. He's a secondary school teacher who has worked in Catholic, independent and Orthodox schools all over Melbourne. His subject areas are the humanities and religious education. He holds a Master in Educational Leadership and numerous other degrees and diplomas. His interest in classical education grew from a kind of disillusionment he has felt for many years for the woeful state of education in Australia. Kon is one of the co-founders of the Australian Classical Education Society and is currently the sitting president of that organization. Most parents and teachers want what's best for their children. There's no doubt about that in my mind. One of the best gifts they or you can bestow on your children is helping them become courageous critical thinkers, active citizens who can observe reality and interact with it in a moral and respectful way. I would like this episode to be a kind of call to arms to help proliferate classical education and create a much needed change in our civil discourse in the long run. There's quite a lot of ground we need to cover today, so let's just dive in. Jonathan, Kon, very warm welcome to the New Orchard Show. How about we start with a short introduction and maybe kick off with you, Jonathan?
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you for the invitation as well. So, as you've said, my name is Jonathan Hili. I'm a high school teacher where I primarily teach religious education and humanities. And in terms of my educational background, it is mostly in humanities and theology, so philosophy, history, and those kind of areas. And for that reason, I've been particularly conscious of my students over the years. I've been teaching for over 20 years now. And I'm just conscious of the fact that many of them don't approach thinking in the way that has the rigor that's needed, the precision that's needed, the kind of critical skills that we apply to thinking about topics or thinking about hard questions. And I think many of them find it difficult just to sit with questions and ponder them and reflect upon them. And then, as a religious education teacher as well, I see kind of there's a real spiritual vacuum in our schools. I teach at a Catholic secondary school, and I think it's just as apparent there as it is in state schools. And for this reason, it's been a particular concern of mine. And a few years ago, about 6 years ago, a colleague of mine who discovered classical education began speaking with me about it, and with Con as well. We were all teaching at the same school back then, and that led us to really making a concerted effort to actually start up a movement, particularly after we looked at what was happening in the States, and we were really buoyed by the fact that, things are going so well there. And for that reason, we decided to start an association, Australian Classical Education Society, or ACES, and it's pretty much taken off ever since. So that's kind of where I'm approaching things from.
Fantastic, Jonathan. Thank you for that. Now over to you, Kon.
Yes, hello. My name is Kon Bouzikos, and again, thank you, Patrick, for the honour to speak on your program. And look, like Jonathan, I'm also a high school teacher. I've worked in many different educational settings. At the moment, I'm teaching in the Catholic school, and what what I find a little bit challenging and difficult is that many of the students in the classroom that I teach are not always able to make connections between the content that they're learning in different subjects. Um, Teaching and learning seems to be very, very segregated. And what drew me to the movement of classical education is the integration of subjects and knowledge. And I find that that's something that we really need to further explore here in Australia. And the other thing I want to say is that I really like the term virtue and virtue formation. That's a very common term you hear in the classical education renewal. And through ACES that was established a couple of years ago with Johnson and a few others. And I must say, at the moment, we have over 500 members across Australia who support, our mission and our work, and are fully supportive of what we are trying to do as an association, a voluntary association, I must say. So this idea of virtue formation and human flourishing, I think they're words that really appeal to me, and I think are starting to appeal to parents and to teachers.
That's wonderful, Con. Thank you very much for that. Now, we've got quite a lot of ground to cover, so I'd say let's just dive into it, as we have to work through two parts of this interview. The first part is focused on introduction to classical education, and the second part will be focused on what the two of you are trying to do in Australia. I want this episode to be a bit of a primer for people who are not really familiar with the principles of classical education and its foundations. So how about we start with the basics and talk about what is classical education and where did it originate?
So classical education, I mean, the nomenclature around that isn't something that has been used until recently. But really what it does is it's describing a form of education that was dominant in Europe for most of history, really up until the beginning of the 20th century, the end of the 19th century. It has its roots in classical Greece and Rome, was heavily influenced by Christianity into the Middle Ages, and then really flourished with the early modern period. And when you think of some of the great minds of our society and our history, like Isaac Newton, Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Aquinas, all these people were kind of schooled within a classical setting. So in terms of trying to understand what classical education is, it's a bit difficult to pinpoint precisely what it is, because it has taken many forms over the centuries, and depending on the culture um, in which it's kind of grown. However, I like a definition that Dr. Christopher Perrin uses, where he highlights some of the key terms associated with classical education. So I'll just highlight some of those just in terms of getting a definition. So he talks about it as being commenced by the Greeks and the Romans, and also extending throughout Christianity. And so what that tells us is classical education has the kind of basis of thinking that we find in Greece and Rome, particularly the emphasis on philosophical thinking. But then it has, and also the kind of virtues that the Greco-Romans used, those kind of traditional virtues like justice and fortitude and prudence and so on. But then as it goes into the Christian world, it becomes spiritualized. It's very influenced by Christian theology, and it also therefore picks up Christian virtues as well, like faith, hope, and charity. So this is the kind of grounding of classical education. So what's involved in that also? We have piety, the idea of respect due to God, but also respect due to our elders, respect due to one another, and to our culture. There is a theological underpinning. So when we approach education, it really isn't seen from a kind of secular perspective. It's seen as within the province of God's creation and mission. It heavily involves the seven liberal arts. They are the Trivium and the Quadrivium, and I know we'll get into those, so I won't elaborate on that further. It tries to access the greatest ideas and the greatest creative potential of human history. This is usually seen in the great books, which include both written literature, but also art and different aspects of culture. And the purpose of classical education is to cultivate men and women so that they will grow in wisdom, virtue, and eloquence. In that sense, and we may talk about a difference between classical education and contemporary progressive education. In that sense, classical education is really trying to achieve something quite different from contemporary education. So, a couple of things just to finish off, and then I might see if Con wants to add anything. When we use the term classical education, we're not talking about ancient. Sometimes, we look at the two words synonymously, but classical is really about those things which have a long-standing tradition and they're a kind of exemplary form of something. So they're things that have stood the test of time. That's what we would consider classical. So there can be works of literature like the poems of Banjo Paterson or Lawson from from Australian setting that are just as much classical as we might think of Virgil might be. Um, so I think that's probably a good kind of nice summary of classical education.
If I could I just want to add maybe just one point to that question, and this is just from my study of the literature of classical education, and it has a high view of man, where the human being is a person of intrinsic value, and we want the human being to excel and to flourish, and how we view the student in the classical school is very pervasive. So I just wanted to add that in the classical school, um, man has a lot of value, and we want students to feel that they also are valued and honoured, um, for who they are and what they can offer and bring to the table.
Jonathan, in your attempt to define for us what classical education is, you've mentioned the word trivium. Would you mind explaining to us what trivium is?
Great. So the trivium is really at the core of classical education. As you can tell by the word itself, it has to do with three ways of doing. Um, in its simplest form, it really reflects what parents naturally do with their children. So if you think of parents naturally the way they raise young children, really kind of parental pedagogy, the trivium is kind of mirroring that. And as you said, it's a kind of staged education, a gradual step by step process by which a young person grows and becomes a master of their learning. So the three stages of the trivium are called grammar, logic, also sometimes called dialectic, and rhetoric. Um, and these are kind of growing process. So the grammar stage, if you think of that, I like to use the kind of metaphor of a crawling stage for a child. This is where they're learning the rudiments of something. It can be a subject, it can be a topic. So you could apply the grammar stage to something like history as a broad subject, or you could apply it to a text like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, just as a simple text. So in the grammar stage, what you're trying to do is really gain the basics of everything you need to understand the subject or the topic. So that means being able to recognize, copy, and interpret what's the meaning of the text or the subject. It involves the conceptual ways, introduction to the conceptual ways of thinking that are there, memorization of the subject, the key information and observation of that, seeing the relationships between parts of the subject within the subject, but also with other subjects or other areas. And that kind of involves a very kind of simple form of analysis and helping to kind of structure a child in that. So if we took an example of this, like what does that actually mean? Let's say we were going to read Thucydides' account of the Peloponnesian War, which is an incredibly dense text. It often involves, particularly today, it will involve young people in a time and a place that they're not familiar with. So you would need to start with the basics. You would need to start with looking at, okay, what kind of language is Thucydides' history written in? What's the culture of the time? What are the basics of the conflicts involved? What's the geography? Learning simple timelines. The characters, the main characters who are involved. All this is part of the grammar stage. And this is the way we naturally approach learning. So that's the grammar stage. Then we move on to logical dialectic. And this is kind of like a child learning to walk. So they're maturing and they've become comfortable with the basics of what they've learned. So now what they're trying to do is they're trying to kind of connect the individual parts of what they learned, the very basic parts, with the greater whole altogether. So this is entailing more sophistication. They're starting to question more. They're starting to form arguments around the text or the subject itself. And they're starting to kind of draw syntheses from these. So the logic stage involves asking more questions. It involves being able to draw clearer definitions. It involves critical thinking and more kind of precision in understanding. So again, if we applied this to Thucydides, what would that mean? It would mean young people are starting to think, okay, I see that Thucydides is presenting this conflict between these various sides. What kind of accuracy is involved in this? And that might involve a comparison with other historical texts. Um, is Thucydides coming from a particular perspective, and does that color the way he's approaching the text? Um, it would involve young people also beginning to kind of develop arguments about the history itself. So, and these might be very much moral arguments, something that's kind of been very much evacuated from our approach to history now. We don't usually ask these moral arguments, but a young person might be, told, are certain characters doing the right thing in the way they're approaching the war? Or, does this show wisdom and why? So these are the kind of basic questions we now begin to ask a text or a subject now that we've begun to understand it. And then finally, we move on to the rhetoric stage. And the rhetoric stage is really when a student has grasped a very strong understanding of what they're doing, and now they're just kind of running with it. Um, in terms of ages, sometimes you see the way grammar, logic, and rhetoric are positioned. They're kind of positioned alongside different age groups. So grammar will be something like maybe 5 to 9 or 10 years old, logic something like early teens, and then rhetoric middle teens to later teens. That's good. That can be helpful because it does show how the child is maturing and being able to learn more. But it's not so helpful when you're actually dealing with an individual text or something like that. But nevertheless, you see it. So in terms of the rhetoric stage, what we see now is the young person is able to take what they've learned and do something new. This is really about creative and social communication. When we think about rhetoric generally, we're thinking about rhetoric as a way of kind of like social communication that was very much part of the public life of the ancient period. But when applied to the stage, we don't just mean kind of public speaking or oratory. It also involves other forms of creative communication, which could be art, it can be like written compositions and so on. But now the child is being able to take what they've learned and create new things. They can apply their will and their understanding to what they've got and start something else. And this is really important because it helps them kind of develop more confidence in themselves as learners, but it helps them also kind of progress the learning. It's the kind of thing we see at university all the time, that scholars are trying to progress learning further in a subject. And so the rhetoric stage is when we can see that the student is capable enough to start doing this.
There is a second pillar of classical education that underpins its foundations, which is called Quadrivium. And Quadrivium consists of 4 components, which are arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Jonathan, can you compare Quadrivium to Trivium and explain to us what the differences between these two are?
Sure. So when we look at the Quadrivium, it's more like the traditional understanding of subjects. The Trivium is more of a kind of staged process within subjects, whereas the Quadrivium are the basic or the elementary subjects that students learned in the classical or ancient and then medieval period. And I should note that these are basics, so it's not like students only learned the Quadrivium, but they were expected to first learn and master these subjects before they could move on to something more complex. And as you've said, they are arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. So arithmetic is really the kind of basic understanding of numbers, what numbers mean conceptually, the relations they have to one another, um, within within a kind of appreciation of God's creation. That numbers reflect a truth that God has put into the world. And you often see this. You often see with many medieval manuscripts and works of art that Christ is often presented as a mathematician, structuring or as an architect, kind of building things. And this is very reflective of the medieval understanding that numbers are deeply important to the way the cosmos is put together. And so we should kind of almost be in awe and honor of learning um, arithmetic. Obviously, in the ancient world, you had philosophers like Pythagoras and you had Plato, who also had this real deep appreciation for numbers. And even today, many astrophysicists um, see the key importance of numbers in the structure of reality. So arithmetic is the basics, and it kind of models what students learn today. Learning 1 plus 1 and that kind of thing. Very basic way of dealing with numbers. They then move on to geometry. So geometry takes what they've learned in arithmetic, but actually begins to apply it to the physical world, in seeing how numbers take forms and occupy spaces as shapes, two-dimensional shapes, three-dimensional shapes, and so on. And this is hopefully trying to get them to see that what they've learned theoretically actually has a practical application. So the world of the mind and the world of the body joined together. There's a kind of synergy here. So that's the geometry. We then learn about astronomy. Now, astronomy might seem for us today a very strange subject to be learning, because when we think of astronomy, we might think about horoscopes and revolutions of planets that we don't consider to be have much kind of credible evidence anymore. But it should be noted that astronomy, particularly in the Middle Ages, wasn't just about the way planets revolved. It was actually about looking at everything to do with the physical world, and particularly the way the Earth relates to the heavens. Um, and so it's taking geometry and kind of lifting it up. And again, this is also accompanied with a sense of awe and honor towards the subject, because you're having the privilege to study God's creation here. And what it also does really well is, because we're able to kind of take notes, and this, you see a lot of this again throughout the medieval period, take notes of what the heavenly bodies are doing, the planets, sun, and the moon, and so forth. Is it allows to kind of combine the observational data of empiricism with the reasoned truth of rationalism. So again, there's this sense of a kind of um, holistic learning, where it's not just simply about what we can see and what we can touch, nor is it about what we can just think in our minds, but the two go in harmony with one another. Speaking of harmony, that leads us to the last stage and the last subject, which is music. Today, again, when we think about music, we think of it in a very limited way. Basically, instrumental music or kind of choral music or vocal music. But for the medieval mind, music was about harmony. Yes, it was about the harmony that you can create through instrumental music or through choral music. Um, but it's also about the harmony of other things in the world. The harmony of things within nature was seen as kind of having a musical balance. Also, the harmony between hierarchies in society were also seen as having a musical balance. And I think this really is very important for us to learn today, because we live in a world where things are very much out of balance. Things are out of balance environmentally, things are out of balance socially. Um, and I think learning about music and how this can be applied as a subject to balance and harmony within our world can help us maybe inculcate more of this. Also, I should note that music, just like the other three subjects, is essentially mathematical in nature. Now, I don't have much of a music background, but very skilled musicians will talk about the relationship of mathematics in the way notes relate to one another and to produce harmonies and so on.
I'm going to deviate from the script here a little bit, hoping to provoke an interesting answer. You've mentioned medieval times several times in your answer just now. So I'm wondering, why would you be modeling your thinking on that period when in modernity there's this perception that medieval times are essentially dark ages. What's your take on that?
Firstly, that's a very pervasive, but also very inaccurate, almost myth that we have of the Middle Ages, and it mostly arose as a result of the Enlightenment, where there was a real attempt to look at the past, particularly look at institutions of the past like the church, monarchy, and so on, and paint these in a very negative light compared to the project that Enlightenment philosophers were trying to build. But if you ask any historian of the Enlightenment, of the Middle Ages, they'll tell you that Middle Ages was nothing like that at all. In fact, it was a time of great learning. Everything we value, so many things we value, like the scientific method, has its roots in the Middle Ages with philosophers like Roger Bacon, for example, who was a Christian monk. So there is actually a great amount of learning and wisdom in the Middle Ages that we've mostly ignored. I think to our detriment, and that's why classical education. Um, the beauty of classical education is it tries not to ignore the past. Even periods of the past that for Christians probably weren't happy times, like parts of the early modern period. Nevertheless, there were some great things there, and so we try to kind of continue the human story and continue to pass on these important traditions.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Jonathan. It always puzzles me why this perception of Middle Ages as Dark Ages, as the age of darkness, is so incredibly solidified in a modern culture, despite of so much beauty coming out of that period. If you look at art, music in general, it's always puzzled me. Anyway, bringing this back on track, what I wanted to ask you is, you've obviously articulated the components of Quadrivium for us. So I'm just wondering, how are these subjects taught differently in classical education model when you compare it to our modern education? What are the key differences?
Kon touched on something really important in his introduction, where he talked about integration. And this is one of the key, I think, the key aspects of classical education and the way subjects are taught is that they're not taught isolated from one another. So, for instance, if you were teaching arithmetic or if you were teaching geometry, these would be speaking to one another, but they'd also be speaking together with other subjects you'd be teaching. So, for example, if you were learning something in history and you were learning, um, let's say, for instance, let's take astronomy. You're learning about the relationship of the sun to the earth or something like that. Okay, that's great. What you can do is you can kind of marry the two and look at historically how have people seen this relationship, and we can delve into the text to do that. And so what we're doing is we're kind of learning both subjects at once. And this is something that you don't really see in modern schools. I mean, modern schools, many of them tend to be quite big, and teachers are quite busy. That many of them, many teachers I know love integration. In an ideal world, they would love to have more integration in subjects, but they're often very busy. The way the curriculum is formulated, generally by government bodies, doesn't really help integration a lot. And so that's one of the key ways. So integration, I think, is essential in terms of how subjects are taught differently. And then there are different kind of ways of learning. So classical education will apply more kind of communal forms of learning. For instance, debate, discussion, Socratic dialogues. Um, Less kind of, okay, read this in a textbook, answer these comprehension questions. It tries to kind of shy away from that. um, so I think that's another key way that learning is different. Um, Con, do you want to add anything? Because there's a lot. Okay, great. Then other ways would include, the great books. So in terms of learning, the Quadrivium or any subject, you are delving into these great texts that have come down from the past. Um, Even though Euclidean geometry isn't, for example, taught in schools anymore. Well, part of it is taught anymore, but nobody uses Euclid directly. But in classical education, you would go to Euclid because Euclid, there's a lot of truth in there. The way he presents geometrical knowledge and the way you can learn from the way Euclid does it is actually learning at a higher in a higher way. That's really important. Whereas today it would be more kind of revised textbooks that continue to be revised and revised and revised. Um, and so I mean that's a bit of a key difference as well.
Jonathan, you said something about great books, which are the pillar of classical education. It's an absolute necessity for kids to engage with great classical books. Obviously, there is a high level of sophistication when it comes to these books, and we currently find ourselves in a world where most demand simplicity and simplification. So the question is, how are teachers in classical education making the kids not only understand the text, but fall in love with reading? I'm thinking Dante, Shakespeare, Dostoevsky, so very, very complex, sophisticated pieces of art.
They're sophisticated, but not always in the sense that they're complex. The sophistication comes from their profundity, really. So if you look at what classical schools are doing, you ask classical teachers, where do they begin with students? Even students, and usually, would like to begin in the primary age. So what do they begin with? They begin with what do they begin with? They begin with like simple stories like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. They begin with Aesop's fables. They begin with mostly it's narrative, but basic, but simple narrative that anyone can understand. Grimm's fairy tales. Um, these kinds of texts, they are great because they have a great deal of wisdom that can be mined from them, and they speak incredible truths, and they're just beautiful in themselves in terms of literature to study. Um, but they're not particularly complex. And then as students grow older, they're able to deal with more complex work. Um, and this would also be the case with music. You don't start a music student learning Mozart. That's just crazy. You start at a very basic level, and then you work up to Mozart. Likewise with art. You don't start with Turner. You don't start with Michelangelo. You start simple, and then you work up to that. So this is the kind of way this is part of the Trivium. There's a staged learning process. Unfortunately, what happens in many of our schools today, there is an attempt to inject some of the great books in there, like as you said, Shakespeare. But what happens is students have no preparation, and then all of a sudden, in year 9 or 10, they're hit with Macbeth or they're hit with Romeo and Juliet, and it's just out of their league. They don't really, they've never immersed themselves in anything like this. Often they've never read or performed a play. Um, they have no kind of understanding of the kind of language and kind of poetic devices that Shakespeare is using, and so this is just too much all of a sudden. Um, Ideally, a student in year 9 or 10 would be able to deal quite well with Macbeth, with Hamlet or something, but they need to be prepared in the preceding years.
I just would like to add to what Jonathan said that in many of the classical schools in America in particular, when they study the great books, which you are right, they are sophisticated and complex, they do actually have children's versions of Homer, children's versions of the Iliad, children's versions of Dante's Divine Comedy. So they especially at the younger year levels. So they obviously have to tailor for the students' needs. But another thing I want to say is, and I'm sure we'll be mentioning this later, is it's not just what you teach, Patrick, it's also how you teach. One of the principles in classical education is a principle called multum non multa. Do fewer things, but do them well. So, in other words, how do we apply that to the question you asked? We take certain pages, maybe a passage from a great book, and we ask students, to really dive deeply into that one particular passage rather than go into all 50 or 60 or 100 pages. And that's something that many teachers don't grasp, that when we say great books, we are looking deeply into certain segments of that great book. And another thing I want to just add is the Socratic seminar. that goes hand in hand with these great books in these classical schools, where students sit together in a circle and they participate in that Socratic seminar, looking at that great book, looking at that particular passage that they're all studying, where the teacher asks those questions and facilitates that discussion. So I just want to say, yes, they are complicated, but it's also how you approach the study of those great books.
That makes a lot of sense, so thank you for clarifying that. I think it would be worth for you to give us maybe a few more examples of differences between classical and modern educational approaches.
There are pedagogical principles in classical schools. So I've mentioned already one. Another one I want to mention is something called festine lenti, which basically means make haste slowly. The teacher works to model and ensure mastery of each step of learning and does not advance students to further study until mastery has been reached. So, in other words, the teacher creates a learning atmosphere that is conducive to mastery rather than quickly covering material. And that's a big problem in many of our schools today. As you know, Patrick and Johnson, we are in this trap of covering everything. But in the classical school, teachers and students, Patrick, are calm. There is a calm environment because the teacher creates a calm environment through the way they teach. Through these principles, I've just given the example of make haste slowly. Now, we live in a very busy, fast-paced world. We've got to get through everything in 2 weeks, in one term, and our students are they're overexhausted. I know, Johnson, if you want to add a few more things to those principles.
I think Con's highlighted a real key point there, because the way curricula are designed, they're all towards a goal of achieving a particular certificate form of qualification. And that means you have to tick a lot of boxes to show that you can achieve this qualification. So right at the beginning of a child's education, it's geared towards a final assessment. And so they are being taught towards this assessment. And so you don't have much space in between that to play, to break free from it, to do other things, to like make haste slowly, to kind of rest in your learning. And so classical education isn't really trying to do that. Obviously, you want students to reach a certain level. But what's more important is that students actually learn, that they're not just memorizing facts that they can regurgitate, but also they're able to kind of make facts part of themselves so that it becomes true knowledge for them. So when that comes to learning, for example, what Con was saying about using small parts of texts and delving into those, you can really apply that to anything. For instance, let's say in an art class, instead of having to go through, 5 or 6 different modes of art, like painting and like charcoal drawing and whatever, maybe just deal with 1 or 2, but be able to do those really, really well. And then once the student can show they can do this, then they can move on to something else. Likewise in sport, instead of having to learn like 5, 10 different sports in a year, maybe stick to 1 or 2 and actually focus more on the skills and also the achievement in sport, the sense of like healthy competition and camaraderie that comes with sport. These kinds of things that we often don't think about because we're just focused on, okay, you've got to learn this, so then you can learn this, so then you can learn this. That's not really very helpful. And again, I like to always go back to parents and children. You think of like a young mother or father with their toddlers. They're not thinking, okay, I'm going to teach you this today, then this today, then this today, then this today. They might have that in their mind, but when you really sit down with a toddler and you try to teach them a few letters of the alphabet, it's going to go in all sorts of different directions. And you might you learn 1 or 2 letters of the alphabet, but you'll do all these other things, and they'll be worthwhile as well in building that young person. So classical education is really trying to see that, again, the holistic nature of the person, not just giving them facts to pass a test.
The holistic nature of the person, that's really fantastic. I would like us to pivot a little bit and talk about some of the most common misconceptions when it comes to classical education that maybe you could address for us. One thing that interests me is figuring out with the two of you if classical education is a domain of Christians primarily, or if it's more universal than that and has wider applicability to the entire society.
So there are lots of misconceptions around classical education. Oftentimes, you're right, Patrick. It is seen as essentially being the domain of Christians because that's where it's been revived in the United States. But it's not the case at all. As we've said, it began in ancient Greece and Rome. Nobody in ancient Greece and Rome was a Christian. Um, you know, but nevertheless, it was rooted in a kind of truth that transcends, in many ways, transcends different religions. Just the other day, last week, a new Jewish school in New York, a classical education school, has opened up. Um, Now, they're obviously not Christians, but they can see the value of the virtues that come from ancient times and being passed on. And different religions will probably add a few of their own different takes on things, but on the whole, there's a parity here. Your friend from India, there are classical education schools in India. I don't know whether they're Christian or not. I'd be surprised if they were. Um, but it's not something that needs to necessarily have Christianity at its base. I mean, as a Christian, I see how Christianity really enhances someone's education, um, because it allows them to see a spiritual dimension that's often missing from a more secular perspective, and in particular how kind of having this kind of theological frame of learning can add to meaning and purpose in a child's life. Um, but but to me, that's kind of like having a beautiful cake and then having some lovely icing on it. That kind of makes the cake more digestible and better. You don't have to have it for classical education. And so there are lots of classical education schools in the world today that aren't explicitly Christian, Muslim schools, Jewish schools, even secular schools. So that's a key misconception. Now, there are some other misconceptions I'd like to talk about, but Con, if you want to butt in, then I'll go.
Yes, another misconception about classical education is that most people just equate it with the humanities, and they contrast it to mathematics and science. But as Jonathan mentioned earlier in the conversation, a classical education is a whole mind. It's about the whole person. It's looking at all the disciplines. It's integrated. So we have to be very careful that when we define classical education, we don't just say it's about the great books and humanities, but it is about what Jonathan said earlier: arithmetic, geometry, music, the arts, the trivium, grammar, logic, rhetoric. So all of these come together to shape and to form the human person in each child. So we need to be very wary that when we say classical education, it's not just a humanities based. And the other thing I want to say is that many people say that it's elitist. And if you look at all the research that's coming up from the States, it definitely is not elitist. Classical education is education that is available to everyone. To every child, every student, every person deserves to have access to this plethora of the great books, to the virtues, to knowing what it means to be a true human being, and also it's very important that we don't say that it's an elitist kind of education.
Yeah, thanks, Con. That's a really key point. There are actually classical schools established in black underprivileged neighborhoods in the States that have seemed to do quite well. I can't think of the study off the top of my head, but if you Google, you can find there's a study done on how these schools are actually how they're actually progressing, and they seem to have quite positive results. Um, so yeah, going with that idea of elitism, you often hear classical education is seen as being old fashioned, and that's because again people kind of misconstrue what classical means. They essentially think classical just means ancient Greece and Rome, but it doesn't. Um, there are lots of wonderful things from the last 100 years that be just as much part of a classical education. In addition to that, the idea that classical education is kind of rejects technology, um, and is simply about having scholars reading dusty tomes and that kind of thing. But actually, even though you don't want computers to be sent to be the center of a child's learning, human beings should be the center of a child's learning. Nevertheless, there are some wonderful things that are done with digital technologies today that we wouldn't want to kind of just throw by the wayside. Things with like virtual reality technology and so on that can be really great in opening the child's mind, working with their imagination. So I think classical education is really adaptable. It really is. It's not necessarily a one size fits all, and in that way, it kind of gives a lot of creative scope to to formers of curriculum and to parents and teachers to kind of tailor things to their local situation. I think it's really important, and that kind of seeing education at a kind of in terms of subsidiarity, like in terms of like the local level, is being lost. You mentioned it yourself, Patrick, that government wants a lot of control over education, and that's because they see education primarily, apart from building good economic citizens, it's also a tool for control, for building the kind of society they ideologically see as important. And while governments might think that, it's not what parents think. And parents are the primary educators of their children. And so classical education really empowers parents to do this in a way that oftentimes state mandated curricula don't.
It's so interesting that you say that, Jonathan, that parents are the primary educators of their children. My point of view is that parents have ceded way too much ground when it comes to education, and especially in the West have either outsourced the entirety of the process to the state or a private institution. There are too many different factors to blame for this state of play currently to list, but one of them definitely is perceived convenience. I say perceived because subjectively, I believe the lifestyle this mode of operating forces a family into a corner and actually in the end has a negative impact on the quality of interactions between children and parents, and simply put, the whole family dynamics. I know I'm generalizing here a little bit, but broadly speaking, that's what I see. The number of parents who are running a homeschooling program / operation or are contemplating one, despite that number rising, is still quite small. But the things are changing because parents are realizing that mainstream education is not producing critical thinkers. And it's totally understandable why the state, which is trying to continue to socially engineer society and accelerate that process with technology, would absolutely aim to flatten everything, to achieve some kind of a total conformity and uniformity through education. That, to me, that just makes a lot of sense from sort of operating model point of view.
And just sorry, in addition to that, just adding to that, Patrick, that's why you look at classical education in Australia particularly, but also in the States, it's really popular with homeschoolers. It's I mean, there are small groups like ACEs who are trying to build it in terms of the mainstream school system, but really it's homeschoolers that are taking it and running with it because they see this as a form of liberation, a form of way they can actually educate their child. They don't have to have the state do it.
I'm really glad you said that, Jonathan, because I think more and more people are realizing what the potential of classical education coupled with homeschooling is. I want to bring this back on the original tracks, and you've partially responded to that question already, but I'm just wondering if you can maybe list some additional notable benefits that students experience from receiving classical education. I'd want to continue on that path for a little bit.
I think I'll try to highlight some key benefits because there are lots. Firstly, for me, I think at a basic level, it's beneficial to young people because it allows their education to be staged, and so that they can progress when they're ready to progress, and they can actually be um, true owners of their learning, rather than being pushed along as they see they need to be. So I think that's really important that young people feel that they can master their education, that when they learn something, they actually do feel confident in knowing it. Um, that's the first thing. Secondly, I think it's important it allows young people to see like connections between subjects and human learning. Again, that kind of holistic approach that's difficult to see, particularly today, unless it's explicitly made. And so classical education does try to explicitly make it, and that's really good because the world we live in is a unified world. You can't kind of just separate and isolate things. Then there's the whole virtue and discipline aspects to it. That it's aiming to build good young moral people, and I think when we look at schools that are really succeeding in classical education, I would think of something like Hillsdale College in the United States. You look at their graduates, they're high achieving, they're intelligent, they're very socially apt, but they're also very morally aware. They really try to be good people. Now, obviously, we're fallen human beings, so we're not going to be perfect. But the fact that education is deliberately trying to kind of inculcate virtue and faith and the things that make a young person a good person, I think is a real boon. Um, Going along with faith, it has that religious aspect that I think is really important. That it connects learning and the world with God, in the child's mind and in the way they live out at school. And I think all this together is really what will prepare a young person for the world. I mean, our government, they always say they want education to develop functioning and flourishing citizens, and that's really good. But there's often so much missing from education that you're just not getting functioning and flourishing citizens. Whereas I think classical education adds those missing components and really helps build a young person to enter the world in a mature way, in a moral way, and in a way where they're prepared to take what they find in life.
I just wanted to add to what Jonathan said that um, if you interview principals in classical schools, most of them say that their main goal, what they're trying to do at that school, in their school, is to help their students order their loves. Those three words are very, very paramount. In other words, they want the student to love what ought to be loved and not to love what should not be loved. As when in the world we have goodness, we have truth, but we also have ugliness. We have things that are not good and beautiful. So we want and I think the word here is to discern. The benefit of a classical education is that we help the student discern what he or she ought to love, but we want them to understand why they ought to love that particular thing. When they read a textbook, when they read a piece of literature and they see a virtue in one of those characters, we want them to emulate that. When they see a vice in one of those characters, we want them to identify that vice and say how can this apply in my life as I mature, when I am called to make those moral decisions. Back to the word that Johnson just said. So that is a very crucial point here, Patrick, about we want them to order their loves. And the other thing I would just want to add is we want them to develop intellectual freedom. Many of our students, especially in Australia, are not developing their intellectual freedom. Sorry to say this, Patrick, but they're being indoctrinated. They're developing their ideologies, but they're not developing their freedom to really be intellectual thinkers, to be critical thinkers. And that word intellectors, that word intellect, is a word that we don't often hear in educational circles, Patrick. And that's one word that really is mentioned a lot in these circles, saying that guiding the intellect in thinking and discovering. Now that is the benefit of a classical education.
Thank you, Kon. Jonathan, you've mentioned Hillsdale College, which is absolutely phenomenal. I've actually done a couple of online courses with them and thought, what an amazing resource. And so it's just incredible what Larry Arndt and his team have done there and continue to do that. It's very, very impressive. Do you know of any other institutions like Hillsdale College anywhere in the world that are doing something similar at all?
Hillsdale's a real standout. However, there are two particular associations that have a lot of schools associated with them. Schools get training from them. They get curriculum materials and resources and so on. So I think if you look into many of these schools, they'll give you also the same kind of same kind of vibe that you get from Hillsdale, and the similar kind of results. Some of these schools are quite small. They might have only like a few dozen students. Some of them are quite large, about 400 students or more. And these are particularly in the United States. So the two I'm talking about are the Association of Classical Christian Schools, and if you look them up, if you just Google them, you get the Association of Classical Christian Schools. They have a map on their website of their schools and where they're located, and then you can identify each school. You can then go to the school website. You can see videos and things produced by the school to get a sense more of them. And the other one is the Institute for Catholic Liberal Education. Um, Likewise, they're an association that has dozens, perhaps a couple of hundred schools involved with them um, throughout the United States. The Association of Classical Christian Schools tends to be more evangelical, although I think they might have some mainline or traditional Protestants as well. Obviously, the other one, the ICLE, is a Catholic institution. But they're a great place to start to look at schools that are functioning really, really well. Some of the schools have a number of campuses throughout the United States that shows how well they're doing.
I just wanted to add, and this is important because there's also a connection here in Australia. But in America, there is something called classical conversations. Classical Conversations is a leader in the home centered education movement, which equips parents and students with the classical tools of learning that are needed to discover, the order and beauty of God's creation. So they are a network in America, and the reason why I bring them up is because we also have a network here in Australia. There is a young lady called Cherie Harvey who lives in Queensland, and she is the coordinator of classical conversations in Australia. And from my understanding, she has already created some of these classical conversation type homeschooling for parents in Queensland, I think in New South Wales, and if I'm not mistaken, in Adelaide. And so that seems to be also growing, and it goes back to the point Jonathan said before with the homeschooling movement. So it is another option for parents that want to have their children classically trained using the classical conversations pedagogy and principle. And I just want to also mention very quickly Memoria Press. They're a publishing company in America, and they produce simple and easy to use classical Christian education materials for homes and private schools. And they have a catalog that comes out every couple of months where there is a whole plethora of literature and books on rhetoric and logic, and that parents and teachers can access. So that's another useful resource to know.
I think we're in a good place to switch to the second part of the interview. In the first part, you have given the audience a very good primer, an introduction to basics, and an articulation of benefits of classical education. With that foundational knowledge, the people in the audience would be asking, what do I do now? What's the practical application in where I live? What are the options in Victoria? What are the options in New South Wales? What are the options in Queensland? And so on. And this is what I would like us to cover in that second part. How about we start with something simple like, what really inspired you to pursue the establishment of classical education schools in this country?
What inspired us and others to establish the classical education schools in Australia, the movement, in other words, what inspired us, Patrick, was the lack of rigour in education. The first point is there is just a lack of rigour and just a lack of discipline. We hear many cases where teachers are just burnt out because they just cannot discipline students. So we believe that classical education is offering a way where students are disciplined because of the demeanour that the teacher brings to the classroom. The teacher has a certain frame of mind that he or she brings to the classroom, and that permeates the whole school. And I have to say this, we haven't said this in our conversation, but when we talk about classical education, it's also about the governance in the school. It's not just the pedagogy and what happens in the classroom, but it's also the way the whole environment of the school, the way the school is governed, the relations between principals and teachers with parents, all that permeates the way we behave towards another. So we feel that all these elements, Patrick, are important in having this movement, because we hear about the problems with education in our country. I just want to add that classical education, it fosters wonder and awe. I'm not sure if we've mentioned those, maybe we have, but they are two catchwords that we need to really keep mentioning: wonder and awe in our students. We want our students to wonder at what they're learning and what they're seeing, what they're hearing, to pause, not to be in that fast pace of run. Or back to what Jonathan said, that we've got to get this done in the next week or so. If I don't, I'm not going to. And we haven't mentioned this, gentlemen. Not everything in the classical school is assessed. Assessment does not drive the school. Whereas we live in a world where everything is assessed. Goes back to what Johnson said. So that is a very important element to catch here, Jim, that not everything that is in the classical will be assessed. So they're the things I want to say.
And I suppose I'll just add to that in terms of like what else was kind of driving my passion for classical education. Um, when I first graduated high school, my first degree was a liberal arts degree, and that really exposed me in a very kind of serious and structured way to some of the great books. Reading Herodotus, reading Livy, reading Plutarch, reading Dostoevsky and Kafka and others like that. And I remember reflecting on it at the time, thinking, why wasn't I reading this in high school? Because I knew that I probably could have, at least parts of it. And I thought, why were we reading textbooks and not reading this? This is so much better. And so now I suppose I just want to live vicariously through my students and have them read it. So at least that way I can kind of have that dream fulfilled.
I can definitely relate, Jonathan. I think I was a bit unlucky, and quite possibly it's not fair to blame my English teachers for my lack of love when it comes to reading classics. But I really disliked how the program was structured back then, and probably continues to this day. I was asked to memorize and regurgitate passages without understanding the meaning. My ability to read and comprehend was absolutely annihilated, and it was only in my late 20s I've managed to rediscover my love for reading and my love for all things classical. Listening to what the two of you have been saying here today, it's evident that throughout your teaching careers, you have observed or witnessed a high degree of disharmony in the educational system. Australia is a very wealthy country, and the state spends a ton of taxpayers' money on education, so lack of funding is definitely not the issue here. Now, the government bodies must see the basic data of outcomes delivered through classical education. They can assess the kids that come out of the system and see superior abilities, better results, higher confidence levels, just all-round polish maybe being more complete. The solution is right there, in plain sight. So why wouldn't they, meaning the official government bodies, the educational bodies, look at this more seriously? I mean, what do you think is happening there?
Why is it not happening? I think a number of reasons. Look, I think our society is in this present moment. We've got this kind of allergy to the past and to Western tradition. A lot of it's probably brought on by a lot of post-colonial guilt, I suppose, and for that reason, we really want to shy away from these kinds of elements. But alongside that, we also have this sense that, all right, what's good and what's best is whatever is more up to date. And so when you couple a kind of fear of the past with a desire to be up to date, then you get kind of contemporary education. And so I think I don't want to blame anyone in government, because writing curriculum is hard, and trying to kind of satisfy everybody is difficult. And I think governments try to do that because, realistically, we talk about the kind of ideological underpinnings of curriculum, and there is, but like nobody's sitting down writing a curriculum thinking, oh, I'm going to, slyly sneak this in here. That's not how they're doing it. Essentially, a lot of what they're doing is they're sending out samples, they're getting feedback, and they're trying to kind of put everything together, which can be quite difficult. But I think by doing that, they're not coming from a grounded a grounded place that has meaning and purpose, and seeing this meaning and purpose injected into education. So it's funny, Con said before that students are being indoctrinated. I think actually it's the opposite. I think they're not being indoctrinated. I think that's doctrines, that is to say, hard beliefs about life and truth, is exactly what they're missing. And I think that reflects a society that also seems to miss that.
Why isn't it not happening today? The simple reason is of the view they have of man. They don't have this high view of man. They see man as someone who is a cog in the machine, someone who's going to be who's going to go get 12 years of education, obtain a certificate or a degree, choose a job, contribute to society through his or her job and the pursuit of that job, perhaps get another job a couple of years down the line, and that for them is a flourishing human being. A flourishing human being is someone who is in employment, who has skills, who can maybe speak a few languages, who is, and look, we don't say that it's not good to have skills. Yes, skills are important. However, we want that person, Patrick, to be a flourishing human being. Classical education is first and foremost about human formation. We want to develop better human beings. And I want to just finish with those three words: better human beings. We want them to become lawyers and architects and real estate agents and nurses, but we want them to be good people who are aware, who have got good virtues, and also who are good citizens. We want to develop a good, active citizenry where we are not cancelled out because we have differing views to someone else.
And I think that's probably the first time someone's lumped in the idea of lawyers and real estate agents with virtue. So that's impressive.
Yes, please add a couple of architects into that bag. Like, we really need them as well. How do you plan to adapt the classical education curriculum to fit the Australian context and educational standards? Obviously, you will need to adhere and align to both federal and state regulation in some manner.
So we've actually put together a curriculum team. We're currently in the process of drafting a classical curriculum for an Australian context. Now, this is going to be a long process because it's quite involved. But we have about 20 or 30 people who have signed up, and we're going to be involved at different stages to write up a curriculum. And as you said, like, there's a lot of material from the States, and that's really good. And we can look to the States in terms of models, but we live in Australia, and we really do need to apply it to the place where we live. Australia has its own unique way of looking at the world, and looking at each other and society, and that we can't not have that influence our education. I think that is important. Additionally, we also have to meet the Australian curriculum. So the Australian curriculum is in its ninth version at the moment, and if we're going to have a curriculum that we can provide to schools, that we can use as a basis for an education that gets government approval in Australia, and we need to be able to map that onto the Australian curriculum. It can be done. It can be done. The Australian curriculum is flexible enough to do that. Some areas perhaps a little more difficult than others, but nevertheless, it's a project that we're trying to achieve.
We already have some success stories. There are 7, or if I'm not mistaken, there are 8 classical schools in Australia that were able to satisfy the guidelines that have been set by their relevant educational departments, where they were able to adapt and modify the curriculum, but also incorporate also the classical elements as well. So these schools have been accredited. They have shown to the governing bodies that they can have a sustainable school. They can maintain this curriculum and teach this classical curriculum in the Australian context, back to what Johnson's saying. So we are hoping to converse with these schools that have already done it, and done it well, I must say, done it very, very well. And it just goes to show that that it is possible. It is possible. It can be done.
Moving forward, as you trying to scale things up, how do you plan to address potential skepticism or resistance from parents and educators who are quite unfamiliar with classical education?
There will always be some resistance and skepticism by parents, even by teachers, towards classical education. The approach that we hold and maintain is that we are here to enhance them, improve them, help them do their profession much better. So we do not denigrate the good work that they are doing in their schools. Now, I respect and value every teacher in our country. However, I believe that many of our teachers, Patrick, are overburdened, are stressed, and are seeking something more noble. Something more noble, something that really makes them click with their students. So what we're trying to do is, and how do we do with the skeptic? We say that, look, just consider what we are offering you. Do your research, explore it, ask questions, and then come to a conclusion. What's happening at the moment is that many people don't know that there is an alternative called classical education. So we are trying to just get it out there, bring awareness. We've had a few public information evenings, so we're going to continue doing that, where people can actually hear about it and say, oh, what's this thing, classical education? Maybe I should just look into it a little bit more further. So we are, we're just here to be, we're a voice, and we're here and we have a website, as mentioned earlier. Look, so where people can just go to that website and look at our resources, and just come. I'll finish with this, Pat. We want people to come to their own knowledge, to their own conclusions about why this is something they need to consider. We can't coerce anyone. I can't coerce it. All I can do is influence, and that's the role of. We are here to influence the discussions, the narrative in education in our country.
Many people who might be initially skeptical about classical education, once they learn more about it, a lot of that dissipates. It doesn't mean they'll necessarily agree, but they will see some benefit to it. And I think Kon touched on another really interesting point, that we have a considerable teacher shortage in Australia, and it's only going to become worse over the next few years. I think a lot of that isn't a result of teachers being underpaid. I think a lot of that isn't the result of students necessarily being badly behaved. I mean, students are students. Young people are young people. They haven't really changed much. I think a lot of that isn't really the result of teachers being overworked, even though they are. I think at the core of it is that teaching in Australia in the 21st century has no like unifying meaning and purpose. It really doesn't. I mean, oftentimes we're being told that we're teaching young people so that they can get a better future, and by what we mean by better future, we mean giving them skills so that they can get a good job. And as important as that is, that's not really going to drive a person very far, particularly when they're in conditions where it's not great and they could easily find another job themselves. So I think one thing classical education does is it does give a deeper meaning and purpose to the profession of teaching itself, and teachers find this incredibly enlivening. They're passionate about it. A lot of the people we've come across in the work of ACEs are teachers who are just unhappy with the current system, not because they're not getting paid, not because they're busy, but because there's nothing's driving them. They don't see why they should be doing it. And they see classical education and it gives them a new mission. I don't mean to be evangelical about it.
Oh, there's no harm in being evangelical every now and then, Jonathan. This crisis of meaning and the absence of vision that you've mentioned, I think, yes, it definitely affects or afflicts teachers, but it also has permeated into the entirety of the society. People really struggle defining or deriving meaning from what they do day to day. So that's not a surprise at all. Now, talking about teachers, what qualification and training will those teachers need in order to work in your classical educational schools? Will they have to fully retrain, or is this just a little bit of tweaking and adaptability to the needs of classical education? How does that look like?
All of our teachers who are trained in our universities have not had that classical training, have not been exposed to these principles that we've been mentioning, to the philosophy behind classical education. So if we're going to create schools, first and foremost, we need to first create teachers. We need to mold our teachers so that they are equipped, that they feel confident to be able to walk into a classical school and to teach and to mold the students. So how do we do that? Look, at the moment, when we are nowhere near what's happening in the States. Now we happen to have a liberal arts college. We have Campion College, which is in Sydney, which is Australia's first liberal arts college, where who are who are committed to this vision of a liberal arts education. So to answer your question, we need to offer courses, teacher certification courses. So, and I know this is going to be asked, but we're hoping that one day we can offer a certificate in classical education, where a teacher, Patrick, can undertake some units of work, maybe 8 units of work, and it can be offered online. Where they look at the pedagogy, they look at the anthropology behind classical education. So when the classical school does start whenever it happens, that teacher's already got that frame of mind. You know what I mean? Because you can't just get any teacher, plug them in and say, yeah, can you come and work in our school? Would you agree, Johnson? They have to have that frame of mind. They have to be able to emphasize and understand it first.
I think where we're at the moment in Australia, the best approach to this, because obviously any teacher with some kind of degree in education can teach in a school in Australia. That's not an issue. But oftentimes, ironically, they have to be kind of retrained from what they've learned at university. So I think where we are is, ideally, we would like to have relationships with some of these institutions in the States that train teachers classically. Um, as you're aware, like Andrew Kern was here not long ago from Cersei, and he kind of banded about the idea of perhaps Cersei having a branch set up in Australia, and that would be geared towards training teachers to teach classically, and that would be excellent. But I think at the best, what we've got at the moment, we do run online courses. You can take online courses from like Classical U and other places in the United States. Um, we would love to set up opportunities to actually go to some of those schools in the States and have like internships. I think that's where we have to start, at least over the next decade or two.
Yes, I was at Andrew Kern's presentation and I thought it was fascinating and fantastic. And I'm glad you guys have organized that and brought him from US. I'm just wondering here, for this to go mainstream, or like partially mainstream at least, does a school need to contain or have 50% classical education teachers, 75%, 85%? What does that need to look like to be truly successful?
100% is really what you want. Um, it's true that teachers will learn on the job, um, and if but you do want to start with most of your staff, if not all of your staff, being aware of what classical education is, the proper pedagogy behind it, and so on. The way we would do this in Australia, like there are classical education schools in Australia. Some of them function at maybe 50% kind of classically, some more so. Um, we would seek training from them because they're already doing it. Victoria doesn't have a classical education school, but I suppose if we began one, we would need to kind of work in relationship with these schools to kind of train up our staff, which is not. It's difficult and it will take time, but it's not overly difficult because we do have a lot of teachers who are doing these courses right now, and so they would be ready to be put into a classical classroom. Right, they have a bit of a further way to go, but they would be ready to get started. All we need is a school.
And I suppose I would just add that it has to be ongoing, Patrick and Johnson. Yes, some teachers have done these courses, and good on them that they've enrolled in the classical U courses. And however, a classical teacher is always learning. And that is another key tenet of classical education, that you are forever learning, you're forever excelling. Um, um, Even if you've been teaching for 20 years or 10 years in the classical schools, it's always because there is so much more to discover about this movement, about the principles behind it. I mean, look, in America, they've been doing it for 30 years, and look, we are just at the infancy stage. So, um, I suppose you retain teachers by just asking them to continue reading. There's a lot of literature out there, Patrick. There's a lot of great books being written about the classical education movement. So obviously, we encourage teachers. But another thing that we would like to do one day, and this will be a blessing, we would like to have our own journal, some kind of a magazine, where teachers from these classical schools around Australia can contribute an article about something he or she did in class. They can share some of the research behind. So I think that's also important. If we can have our own academic journal in Australia, then I think we're slowly making big leaps.
Con, just to add on to that, because you mentioned Campion College before, graduates from Campion College are another really good source for teachers for classical schools. And really, there are other schools like Augustine Academy who have senior secondary students who are classically trained. In 5 years' time or so, they'll be a good source for teachers as well. So I think we're starting to slowly build a basis from which to draw teachers.
I'm very glad to hear that. It's a very positive outlook. Community is a very important part of education. So I'm wondering, how are you planning to involve parents and the community in the educational process and just general school activities? Is that a big part of classical education at all?
Absolutely. Classical education is a communal education. And so parental input's really important. Oftentimes, classical schools tend to be smaller than mainstream schools, and this really facilitates parents being involved. By being involved, I mean in the ordinary functioning of a school, being on the college board, those kinds of things, but also being involved in the continuous journey of their child's education outside of the classroom. The classroom is not really the end of the education. Um, and so we would expect, and classical schools do this already, where they set tasks that students will work on in class, and then they will continue it at home with their parents. And this is part of the idea of kind of, again, holistic education, that education is part of the community. It's not solely something you do within the four walls of a classroom. So, yeah, parents definitely need to be involved in lots of ways.
I've spoken to some of the principals of the classical school in Australia, Patrick and Johnson, and what they've told me is that they actually organise parent seminars. So the parents that attend these schools, because they don't know much about classical education, so they are also being classically trained as well. Because, as I said, this is very new here in Australia. It's new territory. I was speaking to Father Stephen, who's created St. John of Cristan in Brisbane a couple of months ago, and he has regular parent seminars where he gets some speakers and they together they may even have a book study club, so that's another way where we can involve parents, Patrick, through book study clubs where you read a book together, parents and teachers, and it just goes back to what John said, that we're all learning together. And there's nothing wrong. There's nothing to be shameful of a teacher and a parent learning about this whole, this whole beauty of classical education.
And I also think because classical education is really popular with homeschoolers, there is that natural connection between homeschoolers who then, might send their child to a classical school but still be involved in their education in a very similar way.
And if I could just quickly add, sorry, Patrick and John, I'm not sure if you've heard, Patrick, of Pared schools.
I haven't, no.
Yeah, and Johnson, please come in if I miss it. But we have some schools in Melbourne and Sydney, if I'm not mistaken, that are Pared schools. That are schools that encourage parent participation, parent involvement. I think we have one here in one in Linfield or somewhere Listerfield, somewhere there. And one of our committee members sent his children to that particular school. And actually, Jonathan mentioned before Andrew Kern. Andrew Kern, who visited Melbourne recently, actually went to this pirate school to speak to the staff and tell them about what they're doing and how classical education can complement what they're trying to do in their pirate school. I'm not sure if you want to say a few more words about that, Johnson.
Oh no, just only a PARED is an acronym for parent education, because the parents actually run the education within the school. So everything's accredited. It's not homeschooling; it's actually an institutional school. But parents run the education, and so that fits kind of almost hand in glove with classical education. So Andrew got a very warm welcome there.
I think that's really fantastic that there's so much space for parents to get involved, because at the end of the day, they will help you promote this style of education. I'm absolutely convinced of that. You two are on this wonderful mission. You have a vision, you have a sense of direction. Obviously, all of these things that you want to put in place require a certain amount of funding. So I wanted to ask you, how will you fund the establishment and operation of your classical education schools?
So, in terms of ACES, as Con said, we are a voluntary association. We rely on donations essentially for much of what we do. And when we offer courses, they usually come at a cost, and so we're able to recoup some kind of profit from that, which is good for us. Um, but yeah, we're essentially voluntary. When it comes to classical education schools in Australia, the ones that have been established, um, they they are partly funded by the government because they meet the Australian curriculum standards and everything. They are partly funded by the government. They're also they're all independent private schools, so they're all parents will have to unfortunately also um, put in some fees involved. Other institutions like Campion, they have investors. Um, so it's usually a kind of it's a mix of different sources of funding. Basically, when it comes to classical education, because we're just starting, wherever we can get funding from, we'll go for that.
Some of these classical schools, in particular in Queensland, that were established, saw a lot of financial assistance from people in business, business leaders. So we are hoping that more people in the business world, Patrick, will slowly grasp and get on board with classical education, and just make that donation, make that financial contribution, to a school that perhaps their own children could attend, or but everything starts with the need. If you can convince, Patrick, people of the need to do these schools, then I think the funding will come. I think once you can convince people, in a polite, in a convincing way, why we need to do this. Again, I don't use the word coerce. We never coerce, and we as ACES, we don't coerce people. We just wait, and if somebody wants to make a donation, now we always thank them, and we welcome everything we do. But we want, when people see the need for this type of school, then I think people will not only put ideas forward, but will also give financial backing.
I'm really glad no coercion is involved, Con. That's very good indeed. Obviously, what you guys did here today is you've managed to outline in the second part of this interview a bit of a vision of what you're trying to do, what you're trying to achieve with classical education in Australia. If you take a long look at the next 10, 15, 20 years, what do you think classical education will look like in Australia? How is that vision manifested into reality?
We will see some areas in Australia where classical education will definitely grow. I think in Queensland, in particular, I think in Western Australia, where we've already seen the seeds of these schools develop. Many of them, some of them are quite new. So I think, given 10 years' time, the fruits will show, and I believe they'll be positive. So I think they'll spur on other offshoots in those states. So I think there's some areas of Australia where classical education will grow. We'll be seeing more schools. I think, depending on how depending on what happens with homeschooling, because homeschooling is on the increase, this could also be an opportunity for the growth of classical education. Um, but it really means tapping into homeschoolers and convincing homeschoolers to invest in bricks and mortar. Um, I don't anticipate that there will be much political change. Unfortunately, politicians in general don't really like to say much about education because it tends to lose them votes rather than gain them votes. And there aren't really any who seem to, any that are still in politics that seem to be really wedded to classical education. So I don't see anything happening politically. I do hope, though, that some religious institutions will probably invest in classical education.
Just to add to what Jonathan's saying, look, I think the future is looking good for classical education in Australia. And the reason why I say this is because one just has to look at the daily news or read the daily newspapers. There seems to be a rise in youth crime. In many of our states at the moment, there is a rise in substance abuse, in self harm, in violence. So many students are finishing 12 years of education, Patrick, and they're just disillusioned. They are simply disillusioned, angry, don't see the meaning in life. So I think and look, I'm not particularly happy when I turn on the telly and hear these news, but I think what's happening in the world at the moment in Australia, I think it's going to cause many parents and policy people and people in universities and education to find what is actually going on with the way we're educating our students. Why are we churning out young people who just have no sense of connection? Goes back to what Johnson said, who don't see any value in being good, in being a good citizen, in getting involved in a political party or voting or having a view. People are just, there's a big disconnect. So I think that will eventually lead to those other questions about is there something that we're not doing quite right in the way we're educating our kids. So I think that gives us hope. The other thing is, in terms of our long-term goals and future, look, Jonathan already alluded to this. We are hoping that we can organise study tours where, groups of teachers can go to the States and can go and experience, these classical schools and witness what happens, because we don't really have many schools that we can visit at the moment, but, there are some growing. So study tours, I think, is going to be happening in the next 10 to 20 years. I can see that already. We know a young Sarah O'Flay in Queensland who will be visiting some schools. I mentioned earlier to you, Patrick, about having some kind of certificate. I think teachers are going to want to say, you know what? I want to get some formal training. I'm all for classical education. How do I get trained? So I think we will offer our own courses. We do have American courses, but I think in the next 10 to 20 years, I think we should be able to create an online platform, Patrick, where teachers, leaders can offer these courses. And whether it be what Johnson said, graduates from Campion College, now where we can use Australian personnel, Australian human resources to offer these courses. Look, we have started talking about this, but I would like us ACES to be more involved in summits. I'm not sure if you're aware, Patrick, but every year we have a National Education Summit. It happens in Brisbane and Melbourne. And, I'm hoping that one day ACES can have a table there where people will walk past. We can have a booth there, John, where people will walk past and see that word classical, Patrick and Jonathan, say, classical education, what's that all about? And they can walk past that booth, Patrick, and pick up one of our flyers and pick up one of the brochures of some schools that are happening in Australia. And again, that leads to that exploration. You know what I mean? So we want to be more present. We want a presence in these forums, in conferences, in summits, in the media. And I want to thank here Kevin Donnelly. Kevin Donnelly is a commentator and a prolific writer for many newspapers. And Kevin Donnelly, Patrick and Johnson, has written a lot about the woes in education, but he's also mentioning the solutions. So I want to finish with this, Patrick. We always hear daily about the problems of education, but we rarely hear about the solutions. And ACES, class education, is a solution.
Kon, you're absolutely right about the need to focus on solutions and not reacting in despair to these strange twists and turns that are occurring in both our culture and our education. Wrapping this up, can you please tell me about access to resources? If you're a teacher or a parent and you're interested in finding out more, doing more research or listening to more interviews, or even getting in touch with the two of you, where should people go? How can people find you?
So our website is www.classicaleducation.org.au. So we would encourage parents or teachers to go to that website, because on that website we have a resources section, Patrick. We have a section where there are resources, there are videos, there are book lists that parents and teachers can read about and access. There are articles. So that will be the first go-to. Go to the website, go to the ACE website. And we also have on that website, we've just done this recently, we've actually got all the schools in Australia. So if I'm a parent living in Sydney and I want to go to a classical school, by visiting our website, Sydney's got a classical school. It's called Hertford College. So, again, we're trying to encourage them to look at the websites, look at the schools, look at Campion College. So that's the first go-to. And look, we want to just continue having public information sessions. We started doing that this year, and Johnson and a few other speakers are up there, and look, we're not after numbers here. We're just after people that want to just come to an evening and that's where we met you, Patrick. And we want to thank you for your time, where parents can just drop by one evening, and come to a session and just ask some questions and learn a little bit about it. So we want to do more of these face-to-face session, because we think that's important as the movement grows. So yes, we rely on social media. But it's always good to have, and Johnson would agree, on that face-to-face interaction where we can actually have that communication, that relationship with people.
Now that you've mentioned social media, Con, our Facebook page, we run the Australian Classical Education Network. We have about 750 members throughout Australia, and there's always nice lively conversation there, people asking questions about those particular questions you asked about resources and things like that. And everyone kind of chips in and gives advice and directs people. So that's a really good place if you want to get started somewhere, meet other people who are interested in classical education in Australia. So that's the Australian Classical Education Network on Facebook. Additionally, for further resources, Con's already mentioned Memoria Press. They're excellent. Also Classical Academic Press. So they're both in the States, but they have excellent resources when it comes to curriculum material or just kind of learning about what classical education is. They publish a lot of great works to do with that. CERSI, the CERSI Institute in the United States, is another excellent place to get started. And then those two associations I mentioned before that have a lot of schools associated with them, they're also great places to get started. But you can always just drop us an email if you have any specific questions, and we'll do our best to help you with that.
Thank you both. I am really glad you two are out there and are putting the hard work to promote and elevate the presence of classical education in Australia. We should have diversity of choices when it comes to education, and we should be experimenting with different programs and different modalities of education. Experimenting, testing ideas, trying out different approaches and measuring outcomes. Kids deserve better, and I firmly believe that classical education, properly applied with passion and dedication, can help solve so many issues embedded in the current mainstream. Thank you for giving us a good primer on what classical education is and what it isn't, as well as talking to us about the good work you're doing now and will continue to do in Australia over the next few years. This was fantastic. I loved having you on, and I will definitely be bringing you back a year down the line for a little update. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you very much.
This was Kon Bouzikos and Jonathan Hili talking about the power and potential of classical education and what they're trying to do with it in Australia over the next few years. Wonderful, committed individuals who really desire nothing but to make a positive impact on education in this country. I've got quite a lot of links for you in the show notes, so please don't forget to take a look there for all the relevant information, data sources, social media channels, and contact details. If you've enjoyed this interview and found it informative, please do share it with your personal network and give us a review. Thank you for your attention today, and see you next time.